What happens when a freshman congresswoman dares to touch the third rail of the Supreme Court, right on the hallowed grounds of Harvard? And will one of America's sharpest legal minds let that challenge slide? Welcome back. Today, we're dissecting a moment that many in legal circles are calling a constitutional earthquake at Harvard Law School, a place where power isn't just taught, it collides head-on in front of a captive audience. Picture the scene: a packed Harvard auditorium, the air thick with anticipation. In the crowd are law students, faculty, and attorneys, people used to sleepy academic lectures on the separation of powers. Everyone thought they were in for another safe panel on how government works. But they were wrong. In a single instant, the entire atmosphere shifted. Mid-presentation, Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan abruptly stopped. She pivoted, locking eyes with Representative Jasmine Crockett, a congressional freshman who has quickly made a name for her sharp constitutional rhetoric. That wasn't a polite glance. It was the signal for a live legal dissection on stage. With the surgical precision that has become her trademark, Kagan began, "Representative Crockett, I need to challenge your previous characterization of our court's recent decisions." The room held its breath. Kagan didn't mince words. She went straight for the jugular. Crockett had implied that the court's rulings were driven by political ideology rather than consistent constitutional interpretation. Kagan flipped the script. The problem, she argued, wasn't the court, but Congress, which has spent years writing vague laws, offloading hard policy choices to the administrative state, and forcing the courts to draw the lines that elected officials should have defined clearly from the start. It was a strategic counterstrike. Kagan shifted the spotlight from judicial overreach to a far more uncomfortable question. Is Congress dodging its constitutional duty? But why such a sharp reaction from Kagan? Because for 40 minutes prior, everything had been cordial. That is, until Jasmine Crockett, new to Congress but certainly no constitutional novice, decided to touch the nerve center of the current debate: selective originalism. Crockett wasn't just debating legal theory. She called out a double standard, the court using history to handcuff Congress, while refusing to apply those same historical constraints to its own judicial power. In other words, the Constitution was being read to favor the court, using history as a weapon to restrict Congress, but adopting a much more flexible approach to expand its own review authority. That bold assessment struck a nerve, challenging not just a justice, but the very justification the court uses for its power. And right there at Harvard, as pens stopped scribbling and all eyes locked on the stage, the showdown between two branches of government, legislative and judicial, officially began. If you want to follow stories like this, where intellect and composure face off against absolute power, hit that subscribe button and join our community at the Jasmine Crockett File. We bring you the political moments that don't just shock you, they inspire you. Her pointed question, redirecting accountability toward congressional drafting rather than judicial construction, created a moment of friction, unusual in academic contexts, where direct confrontations with sitting justices remained relatively uncommon given their elevated status and institutional authority. The audience, consisting predominantly of legal practitioners and students, acutely sensitive to the importance of this direct engagement, fell into complete silence as Crockett contemplated her response to this unanticipated challenge from one of the court's most distinguished members. Despite serving only in her first congressional term, Crockett had cultivated a reputation as a substantive legal thinker, whose thorough preparation typically surpassed expectations for junior legislators, particularly regarding constitutional matters. yet responding effectively to a direct challenge from a Supreme Court justice, especially one possessing Justice Kagan's intimidating intellectual credentials and institutional prestige, represented an entirely different magnitude of difficulty that left even seasoned observers uncertain how she would traverse this delicate terrain. Crockett drew a measured breath, subtly repositioned her materials, and met Justice Kagan's gaze with the composed intensity that had characterized her approach throughout the panel discussion. "Justice Kagan, I genuinely appreciate your substantive challenge," she began, with authentic deference that acknowledged both Kagan's position and the merit of her question. "You've identified a legitimate concern about congressional drafting that merits serious examination. Congress absolutely bears responsibility for the current institutional imbalance, and I've personally championed more precise legislative language that would minimize the necessity for extensive regulatory construction." This opening acknowledgement, accepting Kagan's valid critique of congressional practice, rather than defensively deflecting it, established an atmosphere of substantive dialogue rather than institutional combat that immediately captured audience attention. As Kagan's expression registered appreciation for this concession, Crockett continued, "However, I believe both branches confront similar institutional challenges requiring mutual recognition rather than unilateral remedy. Just as Congress must draft more precise legislation, courts might examine whether commerce power restrictions selectively applied to contemporary regulatory questions, while simultaneously expanding judicial review beyond historical constraints, generate interpretive inconsistency that undermines constitutional coherence." Without elevating her voice, but with remarkable precision, she continued building her case. "The historical record demonstrates the early court exercised extraordinary deference in invalidating congressional economic determinations, with Chief Justice Marshall establishing in Gibbons that commerce power is complete in itself, may be exercised to its utmost extent, and acknowledges no limitations other than are prescribed in the Constitution." This expansive conception of congressional commerce authority endured for over a century before modern restrictions emerged, suggesting that constraining congressional commerce power based on founding-era understanding, while simultaneously expanding judicial review beyond founding-era limitations, may generate precisely the methodological inconsistency causing the legitimacy concerns we're examining today. Then, with impeccable timing that left the room momentarily breathless, she delivered her most penetrating observation. Perhaps most critically, institutional legitimacy demands acknowledging that neither branch has maintained perfect historical fidelity. Congressional drafting has frequently become excessively expansive, while judicial interpretation has frequently extended beyond historical parameters. Recognizing this mutual evolution, rather than allocating unilateral responsibility, might help restore the institutional equilibrium both branches genuinely seek to preserve. After all, constitutional legitimacy ultimately depends on principled consistency, transcending desired outcomes, a standard that should apply equally to congressional legislation and judicial interpretation. The auditorium remained absolutely silent as Crockett concluded with what legal observers would subsequently characterize as a masterful pivot that acknowledged congressional accountability while gently spotlighting the court's own selective historicism. "So yes, Justice Kagan, I completely agree that Congress must enhance legislative precision. But perhaps both branches might benefit from mutual recognition that selective historical application damages constitutional coherence, regardless of which institution practices it. What fortifies our constitutional system isn't institutional triumph, but interpretive consistency that cultivates public confidence in constitutional governance, rather than methodological flexibility that appears to track preferred outcomes. The complete transformation from what had seemed to be a deferential academic panel to a substantive exchange about constitutional methodology that highlighted interpretive inconsistency while maintaining perfect respect created what constitutional scholars would later describe as an extraordinary moment of institutional dialogue. As Justice Kagan's expression reflected both surprised appreciation and thoughtful consideration of this unexpected response, the tension in the chamber gave way to a collective recognition that they had witnessed something remarkable. A junior congresswoman offering substantive constitutional critique of court methodology, while simultaneously acknowledging congressional responsibility, all within the parameters of perfect institutional respect that focused on constitutional principle rather than political positioning. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation that has everyone talking, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our in-depth analysis of the most revealing moments in constitutional dialogue that mainstream media often glosses over. Now, let's get back to the remarkable exchange where Representative Jasmine Crockett's measured response to Justice Elena Kagan's direct challenge completely transformed what could have been an uncomfortable institutional confrontation into a substantive examination of constitutional methodology that left the Harvard Law audience stunned with its balanced insight and perfect institutional respect. Jasmine Crockett's journey to that pivotal moment at Harvard Law School reflected an unconventional trajectory in American politics and constitutional discourse. Elected to Congress in 2022, following merely one term in the Texas state legislature, the 41-year-old attorney had rapidly established herself as one of the most substantive voices on constitutional questions, despite her junior standing in Washington. What political commentators frequently overlooked when emphasizing her relatively recent emergence on the national stage was her extensive background in constitutional litigation and institutional analysis preceding her entry into politics. Before seeking office, Crockett had built a reputation as a meticulous legal advocate who emphasized methodological consistency rather than outcome-driven argumentation, recognizing that constitutional legitimacy ultimately depends on principled coherence across cases rather than selective application appearing to follow preferred results. Her approach to constitutional analysis had always prioritized interpretive consistency across institutions rather than partisan advantage, understanding that legitimate constitutional governance requires principled methodology transcending outcomes, regardless of which branch applies it. Though new to national political debates, she approached constitutional questions with the same methodical attention to interpretive consistency that had characterized her legal career, where persuasive advocacy depended on demonstrating principled coherence rather than selective application. Justice Elena Kagan, by contrast, had established herself over 12 years on the Supreme Court as one of its most intellectually formidable members, with particular expertise in administrative law and separation of powers questions. Before her appointment to the court, Kagan had served as the first female Solicitor General of the United States and as Dean of Harvard Law School, building a reputation for both brilliant legal analysis and pragmatic institutional understanding. Throughout her judicial career, she had developed a jurist-focused approach, combining methodological rigor with institutional pragmatism, often challenging both excessive administrative authority and judicial overreach, while emphasizing the court's limited role in policy determination. Justice Kagan's effectiveness comes from her ability to engage constitutional questions with both doctrinal precision and institutional awareness. One former Supreme Court clerk had observed privately that her questions often probe the institutional consequences of constitutional interpretations, rather than abstract principles alone, focusing particularly on how different approaches affect the balance between branches and the coherence of constitutional governance across diverse contexts. This institutional focus makes her particularly attentive to questions about both congressional delegation and judicial restraint, seeing them as complementary aspects of maintaining constitutional balance, rather than isolated doctrinal questions. The Harvard Law School distinguished lecture that brought them into this extraordinary exchange had been organized as an academic exploration of separation of powers in modern governance, with particular focus on tensions between congressional authority, judicial review, and administrative implementation. The specific panel, featuring Justice Kagan alongside Representative Crockett and several constitutional scholars, had been designed to examine how these institutional relationships had evolved in response to modern governance challenges, and whether current arrangements maintained proper constitutional balance. For 40 minutes, the panel discussion had maintained the collegial tone typical of academic settings, with participants offering measured assessments of institutional tensions, reflecting thoughtful analysis rather than partisan positioning. Justice Kagan had provided particular insight into administrative law questions, noting both the practical necessity of delegation in complex regulatory domains and the constitutional concerns about excessive administrative authority without adequate legislative guidance. The dynamic shifted when Crockett, responding to a question about recent Supreme Court restrictions on agency authority, had methodically critiqued what she characterized as selective originalism in Commerce Clause interpretation. "My concern isn't legitimate constitutional debate about regulatory boundaries, but the court's inconsistent application of historical standards that expand judicial authority while simultaneously restricting congressional power authorized by the same constitutional text. This interpretive inconsistency, applying historical constraints to congressional authority while expanding judicial power beyond historical limitations, creates the appearance that constitutional methodology follows preferred outcomes rather than principled consistency." This critique, suggesting the court's originalist approach applied historical constraints to congressional power while ignoring similar historical limitations on judicial authority, represented a substantive challenge to the methodological consistency of recent Commerce Clause jurisprudence, rather than simply disagreeing with specific outcomes. By focusing on interpretive consistency rather than preferred results, Crockett had framed her critique in terms of constitutional principle rather than policy disagreement, precisely the kind of methodological focus that Justice Kagan's own jurisprudence had often emphasized. Despite reaching different conclusions about specific applications, Justice Kagan's unexpected direct challenge, redirecting responsibility toward congressional drafting rather than judicial interpretation, created a moment of tension precisely because it came from a justice whose own dissents had often raised similar concerns about methodological inconsistency in Commerce Clause cases. "Representative Crockett, I must take issue with your earlier characterization of the court's recent Commerce Clause jurisprudence," she had stated. "You've suggested our decisions reflect political preference rather than principled constitutional interpretation. But wouldn't the more accurate assessment be that Congress has increasingly abdicated its constitutional responsibility by drafting vague legislation that improperly delegates fundamental policy choices to administrative agencies, effectively forcing courts to establish boundaries that legislators themselves should have clearly defined?" This question, framing congressional over-reliance on administrative delegation as the root problem rather than judicial overreach, represented both institutional defense and substantive challenge. By suggesting that congressional drafting practices, rather than judicial interpretation, created the current imbalance, Justice Kagan had redirected responsibility, while simultaneously acknowledging legitimate concerns about institutional balance that Crockett had raised. This combination of institutional defense and substantive engagement created a particularly challenging response situation, requiring acknowledgement of valid congressional criticism while maintaining the substantive critique of interpretive inconsistency that had prompted Justice Kagan's intervention. When Crockett began her response, her opening words acknowledging the legitimacy of Kagan's critique, rather than defensively rejecting it, immediately established a tone of substantive engagement, rather than institutional confrontation. Justice Kagan, I deeply appreciate your thoughtful challenge. You've raised a legitimate concern about congressional drafting that deserves serious consideration. Congress absolutely shares responsibility for the current institutional imbalance, and I've personally advocated for more precise legislative language that would reduce the need for extensive regulatory interpretation. This initial acknowledgement, accepting congressional responsibility rather than defensively redirecting blame, demonstrated both institutional maturity and substantive engagement with Justice Kagan's valid critique. By explicitly agreeing that Congress absolutely shares responsibility and noting her own advocacy for more precise legislative language, Crockett had demonstrated willingness to acknowledge legitimate criticism rather than engaging in institutional defensiveness that would have undermined her credibility and reinforced perception of partisan positioning. As Justice Kagan's expression registered appreciation for this acknowledgement, Crockett continued by reframing their disagreement in terms of mutual institutional responsibility rather than unilateral blame. However, I believe both branches face similar institutional challenges that require mutual recognition rather than unilateral correction. Just as Congress must draft more precise legislation, courts might consider whether commerce power limitations selectively applied to modern regulatory questions while simultaneously expanding judicial review beyond historical constraints, create interpretive inconsistency that undermines constitutional coherence. This reframing, suggesting both branches face similar challenges of maintaining interpretive consistency, shifted the discussion from institutional blame to mutual responsibility for constitutional coherence. By acknowledging congressional responsibility, while gently suggesting that courts might similarly examine their own selective application of historical constraints, Crockett had established a framework of mutual institutional improvement rather than unilateral criticism, a far more constructive approach that demonstrated commitment to constitutional principle regardless of institutional advantage. Without raising her voice, but with remarkable precision, she then provided specific historical context that highlighted the court's own evolution beyond founding-era limitations on judicial review, while simultaneously restricting congressional authority based on historical limitations, directly addressing the methodological inconsistency that had been the substance of her original critique. The historical record shows the early court exercised extraordinary restraint in overturning congressional economic judgments, with Chief Justice Marshall establishing in Gibbons that commerce power is complete in itself, may be exercised to its utmost extent, and acknowledges no limitations other than are prescribed in the Constitution. This robust view of congressional commerce authority persisted for over a century before modern restrictions developed, suggesting that limiting congressional commerce power based on founding-era understanding, while simultaneously expanding judicial review beyond founding-era limitations, may create precisely the methodological inconsistency that causes the legitimacy concerns we're discussing today. Then, with perfect timing that left the room momentarily breathless, she added the most substantive insight about mutual institutional responsibility. Perhaps most importantly, institutional legitimacy requires acknowledging that neither branch has maintained perfect historical fidelity. Congressional drafting has often grown excessively broad, while judicial interpretation has often extended beyond historical boundaries. Recognizing this mutual evolution, rather than assigning unilateral responsibility, might help restore the institutional balance both branches genuinely seek to maintain. After all, constitutional legitimacy ultimately depends on principled consistency that transcends preferred outcomes, a standard that should apply equally to congressional legislation and judicial interpretation. This balanced assessment, acknowledging evolution in both branches, rather than claiming perfect congressional fidelity, established a framework of mutual institutional improvement rather than competitive blame allocation. By explicitly acknowledging that neither branch has maintained perfect historical fidelity, while suggesting that constitutional legitimacy ultimately depends on principled consistency transcending preferred outcomes, Crockett had articulated a standard that applied equally to both institutions, rather than selectively criticizing either. Precisely the kind of principled consistency her critique had originally emphasized. The auditorium remained completely silent as she concluded with a masterful redirection that both acknowledged congressional responsibility and gently highlighted the court's own selective historicism. So yes, Justice Kagan, I absolutely agree that Congress must improve legislative precision. But perhaps both branches might benefit from mutual recognition that selective historical application damages constitutional coherence, regardless of which institution applies it. What strengthens our constitutional system isn't institutional victory, but interpretive consistency that builds public confidence in constitutional governance, rather than methodological flexibility that appears to follow preferred outcomes. This concluding framework, emphasizing mutual institutional improvement rather than competitive advantage, completed her transformation of what might have been a confrontational exchange into substantive dialogue about constitutional methodology. By explicitly agreeing that Congress must improve legislative precision, while suggesting both branches would benefit from consistent methodology, Crockett had demonstrated commitment to constitutional principle, regardless of institutional advantage. Precisely the kind of principled consistency her critique had originally emphasized. The complete transformation from what had appeared to be a deferential academic panel to a substantive exchange about constitutional methodology that highlighted interpretive inconsistency while maintaining perfect respect, created what constitutional scholars would later describe as an extraordinary moment of institutional dialogue. As Justice Kagan's expression reflected both surprised appreciation and thoughtful consideration of this unexpected response, the tension in the room gave way to a collective recognition that they had witnessed something remarkable. Substantive constitutional critique, delivered with perfect institutional respect, that focused on methodological principle rather than partisan advantage. "Representative Crockett," Justice Kagan responded after a moment's thoughtful consideration, "you make a fair point about methodological consistency that I think deserves serious consideration from both branches. While I maintain that congressional drafting bears significant responsibility for current imbalances, your observation about selective historical application raises legitimate questions that courts should take seriously. Perhaps the best path forward involves both more precise legislation and more consistent judicial methodology that acknowledges institutional evolution rather than selectively applying historical limitations. Constitutional dialogue benefits when both branches engage these questions with the kind of principled focus you've demonstrated today. This response, acknowledging the legitimacy of Crockett's methodological critique while maintaining her view on congressional responsibility, demonstrated precisely the kind of substantive engagement across institutional boundaries that constitutional governance requires. Rather than dismissing critique from a junior congresswoman or defensively rejecting her observations, Justice Kagan had engaged the substantive point about methodological consistency while maintaining her position on congressional drafting. Exactly the kind of principled dialogue that strengthens constitutional governance, regardless of specific disagreements about particular applications. For the remainder of the panel, a noticeably different dynamic emerged among the participants. While substantive disagreements about specific constitutional questions remained, the discussion reflected greater attention to methodological consistency across institutions rather than competitive institutional positioning. Most notably, both Justice Kagan and Representative Crockett referenced each other's insights multiple times, building on shared concern for constitutional coherence, despite different perspectives on specific applications, creating what several observers later described as a model of substantive constitutional dialogue across institutional boundaries. The verdict was immediate and resounding. One constitutional law professor described the event as extraordinary, noting how Representative Crockett didn't merely survive Justice Kagan's challenge, she elevated it. By evening, clips of the exchange had gone viral across legal and governance platforms. What trended wasn't a partisan takedown, but a rare display of perfect institutional respect combined with high-level intellectual combat. Experts observed that Crockett successfully transformed a moment of friction into a substantive dialogue on constitutional methodology. By acknowledging legitimate critiques of Congress while maintaining a principled check on the court, she offered a blueprint for how constitutional governance should function, prioritizing consistent principles over institutional advantage. But I want to hear your verdict. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this exchange. I genuinely want to hear from this audience. If you found this analysis valuable, please like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these deep dives. Also, check out the video appearing on your screen right now. It's a story I'm particularly proud of, and I think you'll find it fascinating. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you next time. We are Jasmine Crockett File.